arable farmers and found 25% of all agri-environment activities was actually of an unsubsidized nature. 25%, that is a lot. What was the motivation behind increasing agri-environment schemes and practices, etc., when I wasn't getting paid for it? Why were they doing that? Well, they then dug a little deeper, and that's the joys of some qualitative research. We're obsessed about quantitative research. There's some wonderful things that come out of qualitative research. And they found that when the activity was subsidized, the motivation was financial. If that same activity for another grower in another area was unsubsidized, the motivation was agronomic or environmental. So you can see in subsidized versus non-subsidized, blue is financial. So blue is a big dominant bar when there is a subsidy. When there is not a subsidy, the blue bars shrink in all of the second lines, and the green and the red bars increase. Because environment and agronomic take a bigger role when there is no subsidy. Look at the no-till movement as one example. The no-till movement is a fantastic movement trying to minimize soil disturbance, but in the process of doing that, they have become engaged with soil health. They're all excited about soil health. Now, we can have discussions about what divides us and what's different about no-till and not, or we can identify the commonalities that we have in trying to protect soil, increase diversity, etc., reduce input costs, labor, etc. The no-till movement was unfunded, unsubsidized, and yet it's taking off in this country and around the world. And that is a positive energy that we need to grab on as an alternative food movement and work with. I know there are some subtle differences and some issues that we have to overcome. I don't want to mention the G word. Some of you hopefully know what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter. They are embracing soil health. They are doing all of the right things that we've all been trying to do as an alternative agricultural movement anyway. We have to find that overlapping themes. And therefore, we need to start to think fast and slow. The question from the lady about how do we challenge, how do we reimpose a new paradigm versus just making tweaks within the existing paradigm? My answer to that question is we need to do both. It's like soil health metrics, to simplify and complex. We have to, because it's very easy, we can start this process now. Within the current paradigm, we can move from 1 to 2 species, for example. There's lots of little things that we can begin that process. And I think that is still important. I think that is an important strategy because it begins to open farmers' eyes a little wider. This is possible. I'm seeing new things that I'd not thought before. If this is possible, what else is possible? And it is that stepping stone that I think is going to help with the system redesign, the full systemic and integrated change toward agroecology. Of course, we all understand that that's where we need to be and where we should be going. Absolutely, we all understand that. But I think understanding the pitter-patters of that trickle, of that waterfall, is an important first step to help us get there. So I think we need to do both, begin minor tweaks within the current paradigm, but also have the case studies of those who are already down this path, who are already well down the path towards agroecology, and using these as important learnings, case studies, examples for those still in the current paradigm. We have to do both. Think fast, think slow, short term, long term, both. Okay, almost at the end. I'm going to skip that slide. Therefore, I have to give my final plug to Agroecology Group. Of course, they're here today. Their website is doing exactly this. It's practical ideas on information on how to begin this transition. So if you've not looked at their website, there's lots of resources. I think they're doing excellent work. Go and read some of that material. So I would always end my talks where I begin, or I begin where I end, I'm not sure. Soil health. This is a trend. This is not just a trend, it is a movement, it is happening. We have to use this trend right now to engage with the current paradigm and help drag it to the alternative. there is no surprises that the graph looks like this. This is the opportunity that we have to begin the dialogue of agroecology through the vocabulary of soil health. Soil health has captured the imagination. We have to seize on this opportunity towards agroecology. And I think the answer to that is that we have to come together in the middle, open that dialogue, and find our common ground.
Joel, thank you very much. Just fantastic. And I hope that you'll send that one molecular slide to Minette. I think that would really help. I now have a real pleasure in introducing Hylton Phillipson, who is taking a lot of what Joel has recommended and putting it into practice. Hylton is an investment banker who went to the Amazon and then came back to the Blaston estate in Leicestershire and is working with Tom Heathcote, who he'll introduce to show what extraordinary things they're doing, and particularly interesting to do with exudates and nitrates into the soil. But real pleasure to introduce Hylton.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you, Jane, and Alan, and Joel, and everybody for being here. I want to start where Joel actually left off. He left off saying, God bless you. And I want to start with the opening words of the Creed, which is, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. Now, I'm not here to give you a spiritual talk, but I want to emphasize the invisible, because the invisible has been a great educator to me in my journey and influenced the way that I farm today in Leicestershire. As you'll discover, I have a parallel life. I spent about 30 years in Brazil and fighting to try to save the Amazon rainforest as the best means of buying us collectively time in which to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, which otherwise are going to lead us to catastrophe. But first, a little background. When I inherited the Blaston estate, it was so indebted that I did the only thing that I thought I could do to save my home, which is I became an investment banker. I did not do what Joel did. I did not build 3-story empires within polytunnels. I went to the city, but then I had the great fortune of being posted to Brazil, and that's where I got involved in the campaign to save the forest. And it was only about 15 years ago that, for the first time, a Brazilian scientist who became a good friend of mine, Antonio Nobre, he discovered how the rainforest actually makes the rain. And it's so beautiful that I'm going to share it with you. It's fundamentally because there's such diversity of life in the forest that every day of the year there's a constant flow of volatile organic compounds coming up from the surface of the forest and going into the atmosphere where they meet the moist trade winds coming off the South Atlantic. And these molecules are the perfect size around which water droplets can form. So it rains, and the cycle of life goes on. And it took me some time, but it was only 10 years ago that I really started thinking about farming and became aware, I'm ashamed to say, particularly in this audience, became aware of mycorrhizal fungi. And again, it seemed to me that just as the giant ecosystem of the Amazon was dependent on something that you could only see in a microscope, so the soil, so my farm, so our future in this country also depended on something unseen that you could only see in a microscope. 1997 was a very big year for me. That was the year that my first son was born. It was the year that I managed to get Blaston up to 1,000 acres, debt-free. And of course, it was also the year of the Kyoto Protocol. And one thing that hasn't really, I think, been covered so far by the incredibly rich dialogue that we've been privileged to hear has been this dynamic of climate change. I'm going to ask you to just focus your minds on 3 numbers for a moment. It's a little bit like the sort of nightmare moment of the Today programme when they do that puzzle every morning. But I'm going to ask you to think of 310, 410, and 450. Now, when I was born, which is not so long ago, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 310 parts per million. The level beyond which the science collectively says that we should not go if we want to keep temperature rise this century to 2 degrees, and if we want to prevent climate change from becoming irreversible, is 450. Just in my lifetime alone, we've gone from 310 to 410. So we have already consumed 3/4 of the planet's carbon budget. And the number continues to rise at about 3 parts per million per annum. So just on O-level maths, we've got 13 years to go before we pass the point of no return. Now, Andrew Sells yesterday talked about the 25-year vision for Britain document that the government has produced. My point is really simple. We don't have 25 years. We need to act now. And I do think that one of the relatively few opportunities and advantages of Brexit is it really does give this country the opportunity to lead the world in rewarding farmers for taking carbon from the atmosphere, where it's going to lead to catastrophe, and putting it back in the soil where it belongs. Now, while my back was turned and I was living in Brazil, the Blaston estate was farmed very conventionally and mirrored the trends of British agriculture generally. I'm afraid hedges were removed, grassland was ploughed up, and animals were left just to awkward little fields which for one reason or another couldn't be put under the plough. In good years, we did make money, but it came at a terrible cost. We essentially squeezed the life out of the soil. And just as if you take the Amazon, if you cut down all the trees and you replaced it with pine or eucalyptus, you might actually argue that over a 25-year period you were carbon neutral. You would have squeezed out that life, that fundamental diversity, which drives the system. And that's obviously the same thing that happened to us in Leicestershire. We began to suffer all of the ills of over-intensive arable farming. We had compaction, we had runoff of soil, we had erosion, and we then got blackgrass. And one day, I had an Australian friend of mine, a friend of yours, actually, Joe, Tony Lovell. And I was a little bit embarrassed because I was showing him around my little postage stamp, 1,000 acres, whereas he runs 1 million. And I was pointing to the blackgrass, and I said, Tony, it really is, it's a really, really serious problem. And he said, Hylton, that blackgrass is not your problem. That's the signpost that's pointing to your problem. Your problem is poor soil structure. It is lack of organic matter, and fundamentally, a lack of life in the soil. And then one day, about 10 years ago, we had incredible flooding. And my boys got into a little boat and shot rapids that never existed when I was that age. And we had a great time. But I was looking at the photographs afterwards, and it just occurred to me, wait a minute, this is crazy. That is my topsoil that's going down the river, literally, as well as the next generation, in a rather flimsy boat. And that was a moment of epiphany, and I decided, absolutely, we have to change. We cannot go on as we are. And Tom is going to talk to you now about some of the farming practices that we have put into place, essentially reintroducing rotational grassland and using cattle as an agent of restoring life to the soil. I want to just end on one particular note, which is when we took fields out of this permanent arable rotation, wheat, oilseed rape, wheat, every now and again a crop of winter beans, in 4 years we managed to take the organic matter from 2.4% to 4.4%. That is equivalent to sequestering about 3 tons of carbon per hectare per annum. If you take the 18 pounds a ton that Dieter Helm was talking about yesterday, that could potentially give me an income of 54 pounds per hectare per annum. I have about 200 hectares of grass, and that would therefore give me a cheque of about £11,500 a year. At the moment, my basic farm payment, which makes the difference between profit and loss, is running at about £100,000 a year. And I don't know where that extra 89,000 is going to come from. But we can talk about that afterwards. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Right. Thank you, Hylton. So I'm just going to follow on from Hylton, and I was asked today just to give a bit of insight into how we at Blaston have introduced grass lays into our rotation. As we've heard from Hylton, grass lays have been fantastically important to us in increasing and improving our soil health and our organic matter, but it's also been fundamental in enabling us to reintroduce cattle into the farm and sheep onto the farm in the scale and numbers that we've wanted to do. So, okay, so this is for the arable farmers out there, and I'm sorry if this is if some of you know how to do this, but I'm taking this back to basics for the arable farmers who want to get grass into their rotations but don't quite know how to. So I'm going to start off by saying that this is really straightforward. Okay, and I'm going to talk you through it, and it's low risk for you as a farmer, and I'm hoping I can inspire some of you to do that today. You'll also see as we go through, this is really, it's got low capex, it's got low capital investment from the farmer's perspective. So if we get started, so if we go back to Blaston for a minute, how are we choosing some of our land? So at Blaston, some of the land that we've put into grass lays, it's either, as Hylton said, we've got a black grass problem. So picking some fields that have got black grass, that's a really good field to put some grass lays into. Also, we've all got odd-shaped fields in our arable farms. We've got awkward corners. We don't have to take whole fields out, but we've got those fields. We've also got fields, frankly, that we probably should not be cultivating and should not have arable in them. Leicester around here, you're nice and gently and undulating. In Leicestershire, we've got some pretty steep banks that, as Hylton said, 20, 30 years ago, we ploughed them all up, and actually, we shouldn't really because of the angles on them. So, once we've found some land and decided what land we're going to do, we've then got to find a grazier. Now, I know that in areas like this, where we are in Oxfordshire today, Gloucestershire today, we haven't got very much livestock here, but actually I was discovering and have discovered there is actually livestock around. We've just got to find it, really. And also, it doesn't matter if it's not on your doorstep, as we'll come back to. We can move livestock around the country really easily. Social media is a great way to find some livestock and some graziers. National Sheep Association, they're here. They've got some really good ideas about how we can find some, and I'll come back to that later. So we found some land, and we found a grazier, hopefully. We've then just got to give a bit of thought to what we're going to use this grass for. It's obviously got to get eaten in some way, or it's got to get cut. So we're either going to use our grass for grazing, or for some mowing, or for both, really. Personally, I think we want to graze it. That's the whole idea. If you can't graze it, then fine. Mowing is still beneficial. It's still doing good, but actually we want to get some stock on it and get it grazed. So, who does what in this situation? So the arable farmer. So you've provided the land, whatever it may be. The arable farmer establishes the lay, and we'll come back to that in a minute, because again, people get a bit caught up about that. I think it's really complicated, but it's not. The arable farm will hopefully provide some water, a water point, but again, don't worry, if there's no water in this particular field, we don't have to start trenching in water. Don't need to worry about that. Handling, yeah, okay, so they might have some old handling systems we can use, but again, that's not essential. Hopefully they'll be prepared to muck in and just give an extra pair of hands when we're trying to move stock around, but again, not the end of the world if not. So, what's the grazier going to provide? Well, We could provide some of our Hereford cattle from Leicester if you'd like, but the grazier essentially is providing the livestock in this arrangement. That's pretty straightforward. The grazier is also going to put the fencing up. And in this sort of situations, we're not expecting that the farmer is going to stock fence all his field. That's unrealistic. Not expecting that at all. So us as a grazier, for example, we'll do the fencing. We'll sort out the handling. We'll provide the shepherding, the dogs, the shepherds, the quads, and we can provide the water if we need to. So let's look at some practicalities around this. So seed choice and establishment. At Blaston, if we go back to there, we've got about 200 acres of grass lazing at the moment, and they are all different essentially. So we're across 9 fields at the moment, and we have 9 different seed mixes, and we are continually tweaking our seed mixes for the end use what we're trying to achieve. So in certain fields where we're mainly mowing, that's a very different seed mix to a field that we are looking to graze. As I said, we continually tweak our seed mixes for mixes that suit different aspects, different banks, different soil types. Don't be afraid to experiment with this, and there are some really useful friendly seed merchants out there who've got a fountain of knowledge to share with people, or on social media. A little bit quicker. I'm cranky. Right, okay. Right, so seed choices. Okay, how are we going to establish it? Personally, I would favour using something like this. A set of grass tine harrows with an air seeder on the back of it gets a good spread of the seed. You can drill it with a normal conventional drill, that's absolutely fine, but the gap between the coulters tends to end up getting broadleaf weeds in there, so you can cross drill. Sorry, speeding up. Right, fencing. Okay, I said fencing's not a problem, it's not a problem. What we do, we tend to rock up with a quad and put out temporary electric fencing off batteries. Again, straightforward. Water. I'm sorry if these are someone else's pictures that I've robbed actually off the internet, but take it as a compliment. Water doesn't have to be, hasn't been complicated. You can have an IBC into a water trough. Or, it's one of my clients down the road, thank you, you can have a water fountain like theirs, like that we've sort of cobbled together. Handling, again, Grazier provides the handling. We have like a mobile wrapper system. We tape behind the 4x4. Quirky old photo. And again, we provide the shepherding. Basic payment scheme and compliance. This will move on to something in a minute. The farmer, the arable farmer, he can continue to claim his basic payment scheme. He deals with all of that. The grazier has to deal with the cross-compliance side of it, really, in terms of tags, movements, etc., etc. This will lead on to the next slide. Because in these sort of scenarios, the grazier and the farmer are potentially unknown to each other, I do think you should document this in the form of a grazing license. Now, I don't like documenting for the sake of documenting, but I think this is important, really. And it leads on to, we're talking about documenting this, and you put a license in place. We won't get really boring about this, but the key points are there, really. From having a license in place, it does not create a farm business tenancy. There's no tenancy issues, no partnership issues. And from the farmer, the arable farmer, it's maintaining your active farmer status, trading status, blah, 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 all these tax things, but they are still quite important. Other things to consider, other things to consider. Right, when we're looking at financial returns from this, these vary across the country. So up in Leicestershire and Northamptonshire, a grazing licence per acre, we can easily get £60 to £100 an acre. You come down here, as I discover, and we're on 20 to 40. There's quite big disparity there. And if we're comparing that to the gross margins from a wheat or a first wheat or a rape, yeah, they're worlds apart. But that's not what we're trying to achieve here. What you've got to look at here, so yes, there is an opportunity cost, but you're investing in the future in this. And there is a huge amount of benefit, as we've heard and will continue to hear from having these layers in the rotation. What I would say, though, on this is a point that we were talking yesterday about farmers that want to make these steps and want to make these changes. They need help and they need funding. And this is exactly the sort of area where we need some funding to help bridge that gap between what they can realise from having some livestock on their land to what actually an open market sort of gross margin would be. Last few points. Countryside stewardship. The Natural England yesterday got pretty harassed, I thought, by people in here, because countryside stewardship has been a bit of a disaster. It's clunky, it's not very easy to use, but there are options out there to help arable farmers get into grass and get grass into rotations. There's an option on there called GS4, which is establishing herb-rich swards. It will pay you, the farmer, £125 an acre to put a sward in for 5 years. So if you have that, and then we top it up with a grazing licence fee, we're at £175, £200 an acre. That's a good figure, frankly, at the moment, so I think you should grasp that. Last 2 points. Regional hubs. This is something I feel quite strongly about. When we're in arable areas, there is a lack of livestock. And I appreciate that for some farmers, they don't need to, they don't want to commit a large acreage of grass to this sort of system where I'm trying to endorse here. So actually all we need to do is that Jane will give us 30 acres, Tim, you would give us 15 acres, someone would give us 40 acres, but we build a critical mass, and once we've built a critical mass, then it's a lot easier for then us to bring livestock in to deal with this. Last point. Young farmers and new entrants. Okay, I think we've got a huge opportunity and frankly a duty here to try and help young farmers get onto this. And this is a fantastic way to do it. All it takes is it takes a few of the landowners to dedicate and to make available 10, 15, 20, 30 acres, and we can really make a difference getting some young farmers into farming. Okay, sorry. Run on.
The advantage I have sitting there is that I can see how many more slides they've got to go before they're finishing. But really, thank you both very much, and to show immediately how Joel's science can be translated into productive, profitable, and practical farming, and the cooperation between farms, I think is fantastic. The one thing I forgot to mention in the introduction is that Hylton also is the director of Agrivert, and it's the one biomass or anaerobic digestion process that takes human cooking waste and turns it into energy rather than using agricultural produce to create energy, and that, I think, is really laudable. So, finally, Rob Havard, which is going to be really interesting. Rob is sixth-generation farmer, pasture-fed livestock association member, and really importantly an ecologist working for Natural England. And he's going to tell us particularly about how productivity and ecological gain can work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, just like to thank the Sustainable Food Trust for Farm for the opportunity, and just what a wonderful event it's been here today. Thank you very much. First of all, to say a little bit of background, grew up on a family farm in Worcestershire, and despite not having BSE or foot and mouth, those two diseases had an enormous impact on our family farm, and meant that when I growing up on a 180-acre farm, when I came into the farm business, it was a 44-acre farm. And so seeing that difference and actually seeing that loss, it's interesting how I sort of moved away and playing too much rugby, drinking too much beer, not necessarily interested in the farming side, but you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I think really that's what's fired me up to follow the path I have. Profiting from native pasture, that's a very important first word, I think, that sometimes within our sector of environmental farming we sort of push to the back, and we talk about all the sexy biology and everything, but none of that's going to happen unless we've got thriving, profitable businesses. The more money we can, the better, and let's not be shy about that. That is one of the meadows that I use. It's a nature reserve, and we take the hay from that and feed it to our cattle, and they absolutely love it. In conventional agriculture, it's considered unproductive. There's a green-winged orchids hanging out with the cowslips there. There's over 200 species within this field. But these are things that are now difficult to manage. 95% of these English meadows have now disappeared because of agricultural intensification. So we've lost that resource forever. There are a few left. I think the point is that we can use them within our systems, and we can make these things work for us. These are some of the pictures from that's from one of the farms I rent from the National Trust, and you can see incredibly diverse pastures. The cattle moved just as Joel was describing earlier. Incredible diversity, but also productivity there. And you can see from the grazing we're leaving a lot behind, and that's one of the secrets to what we do in quite a soggy winter and saving money. Again, this was taken. I think on Thursday this week, lady's smock. I think it's just an interesting thing, as we're increasing the productivity, the wildflowers are getting bigger as well. these are all 18+% protein. You know, so people talk about trying to get rid of these. My father's talked about why are you bringing all these weeds back into our farm, and he spent his entire life trying to get rid of. I'm being facetious. He's very supportive now. This was taken. It's not showing up as well on there, but this was taken on Thursday, so the 26th of April. 4,500 kilos of dry matter per hectare. The arrow is pointing, you might just see a little red shape. That's the top of my welly that I've taken off just to show. I think the wellies are a really good way to measure your grass. If it's above the top of the wellies, it's pretty safe to graze it. But it was worth the soggy sock. So there's the soil. So this is an example. This is from, on the new farm we took on last January, so that's just over 12 months. But on a permanent pasture, changing it from one that had a lot of fertiliser spread on it, chemical acid salt fertiliser, and within 12 months we can get incredible aggregations. This is at about an 8% organic matter on this one. This is on the farm at home on very heavy clays. This was taken on a you know what sort of winter we've had, and you can see this is actually dry in the bottom when you dig in there. The soil, the water holding capacity is fantastic, and that allows me to keep my cattle outside all year on heavy lias clay. Horrible soil to manage if you don't get it right, but if you do get it right, you can keep them out all the time. That is at over 14% soil organic matter. Tested loss on ignition. So you've got soil health, you've got productivity, you've got biodiversity all built into the system. In terms of how we manage that, the key thing is leaving enough grass, leaving enough solar panels, as Joel was saying earlier on. And also I like grazing the top section as we go through, leaving plenty of stockpile for winter, and that gives us enough thatch as well as enough food to feed cattle as we go through the winter. And that's just to show again, how we're moving through, how we're grazing, leaving plenty behind, but also leaving a lot of flower heads behind. In nature conservation, we're really good at making loads and loads of rules, which means you can't actually manage these important meadows. You can't graze it because it's the flowering period, but maybe you can graze it, but you just move them on before they've eaten all the flower heads. It's having this flexibility that we don't have. If we don't have it, we can't actually manage these sites, and it makes them uneconomical. Then we need support in order to have them managed. The modular, systems of electric fencing, quick connect, mobile water troughs, that's what I use. Going onto farms, putting that infrastructure in that I know I can take away and I can put it on another farm. So I'm not losing if I'm going into short-term contracts. One of the blessings of this has been that we've been able to get longer-term contracts, 10-year tenancies, on the back of what people see happening in the pastures, and it's really heartening. It gives my business and the future of my family on the farm the opportunity, hopefully, with the longer term. So whilst the grazing licenses are great, it's also good if you've got security and stability to offer that to the people you're bringing into your businesses as well. So that's an important thing when we're looking at grazing stockpile, is that we're stripping it out throughout the year as well. So that's some of the stockpile looks a bit messy, but actually we're getting really good results on it. And the key thing is that they're getting a more or less equal bite of daily nutrition. If we were to let them have the whole lot over the winter and ranch graze it all at the same time, every day their nutritional take is going to be declining as they trample over it. So it's really important to meter it out and manage that body condition and manage their intake. Something we've been trying in the last couple of years, mimicking what folks are doing over in the States, is a bit of bale grazing, unrolling the bales, but using hay from species-rich meadows. So we're bringing the species in as well. We're enriching our existing meadows and our existing grasslands, increasing the diversity, the number of species, increasing the productivity as well. And interestingly, those meadows are now, where they were struggling to get hay made on those meadows because of all the rules and regulations, we've now, by working with about 20 or 30 farmers around us, all of us trying to increase the diversity in our grasslands, working on a landscape scale, there's now a market for this species-rich hay, and actually the people who own these meadows, you couldn't get them managed before, are now having people compete over the hay so a market solution doesn't require any support. So this is on Simon Cutter's farm, another PFLA member who does similar things. Livestock outwintered on the HLS land, and if you've got a good Natural England advisor, then they will tell you you can do that. You can get your prescriptions changed, don't worry about that. Yeah, we'll go through quick. So that's again the biograzing. The results of the biograzing on the sward, you can see the increased growth we've got in this paddock that was taken this week. So you increase in fertility. There's the welly shot. And again, these are, we're getting really good lush forages without fertiliser in April, after one of the longest winters for a long time. A little bit of damage done to pastures, mobile water troughs. That's what I call in that bag of my love bombs. So we get wallflower seed. I wish I'd thought of a better name, but throw the seed on where the damage has been done and turn a slight problem, the potential for weeds to come in, turn it into an opportunity, a cheap way to increase diversity across the farm. We also use green hay strewing, which is using the cattle to graze off very short, cause a little bit of soil disturbance, and then taking green, immediately cut material from these meadows and spreading it. Really cheap way to increase diversity. People using it instead of a herbal lay and going to a seed merchant. If you've got this on your farm, then you can actually use your margins around the fields, around the edges, to actually reseed your pastures, or when you're putting those fields into the rotation, the arable rotation. You've got farmers doing that. Seed companies not so happy, but Okay, really quick. Good gross margins. It's allowed us to go from 44 to 420 acres in about 5 years on rented ground. The potential to increase further. What levels of bale grazing could we get to? I think within a couple of years I'm going to be at industry standard stocking levels, but in the top 1% in terms of gross margin per head, in the top 5 or 10% in terms of gross margin per acre. And also adding value doesn't necessarily have to be through a box scheme. So one of the things I've struggled with is buying livestock that fits into these systems. So I saw that as an opportunity. Some breeding pedigree, Aberdeen Angus livestock that have gone through these systems, slightly smaller framed, fatter cattle that fatten easily off grass, that can help other people. So if I'm providing value to people who are in these systems, then hopefully that's going to put me in good stead as well. And the final thing to put on, could we get farm ecologically without direct support if we actually just use the innovations that people like Joel teach us? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. And although you did the best to hide the screen from me, so sorry to hurry you all along, but I want to get some questions in before lunch, and also Abby Rose wants to talk about NAP as well. But really inspiring to hear how the science can be turned into real practical, fantastic farming that actually looks amazing as well. And I'm going to just use the Patrick prerogative and ask the first question myself, which is, especially with Joel explaining how complex and subtle and multifaceted all of these elements are. I saw a huge amount of nodding faces around the room, but how do we get that extremely complex message across to the 80% urban population? So that's my question to you. How do we convince them of something that's so subtle? Easy one, yeah?
Yeah. Of course, I mean, I can't say that I do have the exact answer. It's not going to be easy, of course, but education has to be part of that. We have to use the tools that we have to engage them. We've touched on some of those things yesterday, relating to reaching out, direct marketing, more of that today. I think all of that, social media, of course, all of those tools we have to lump together and weave them together to have and open that dialogue. It's definitely not easy. We have to meet them in the middle. We have to understand where their position is, what they're interested in, and have that conversation from that starting of that middle point based on their interests and steer it, in our direction from where they're at. That's probably what I would think, but what does everyone else think there?
One of the opportunities, I think, is obviously getting school children on farm. You can get supported through the stewardship schemes for that and advise that. We've had some wonderful farm visits of kids coming around, and it's the inner city kids that actually get the most of it. You know, the very middle class kids that come around, seen it all before, but the kids from the inner cities, they absolutely thrive in that environment. It's all new and it's wonderful. I think the other thing is that actually it's happening through food, is that people are starting to understand all those issues you talk about because they're realising this issue about health in food is coming. There's people like Caroline here with the Primal Meats have done incredible work in pushing and promoting this sort of healthy food narrative, and they're understanding where that comes from. And I think the more we do more of this, that all helps.
I think there's some very good, simple messages. I mean, the classic one is look after the soil, and the soil will look after you. And I think there's a great opportunity for us to actually piggyback on the mass movement like the RSPB, because actually, you know, farming actually has got a bad name over the last half century for the decline in farmland birds in particular. And actually, I say to Tom, the 11th rule that I give him is if it's good for the worms, do it. Because if it's good for the worms, it's good for the birds, it's good for the diversity, and it's going to make us happy too.
Anything to add, Tom?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said. I also think Joel touched on it, I think the power of social media in this is actually quite, has got a huge amount to add to this. And I actually think if we had a few key ambassadors out there on social media who I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but people that have millions of Twitter followers, you just need some of them to hashtag some certain things.
Thank you, Kim. Hello? Thank you, Kim, and thank you all. And I have a little, well, especially some of the things you said, Joel, and then all of the examples you guys gave. And it's a plea to everyone that I think I completely agree about embracing the complexity of the soils issue. And my call would be to, why don't we start measuring now and observing now? And for the farmers to take this opportunity, you know, if science isn't quite there yet, why don't we start finding patterns on our farms and making observations and really documenting what's happening in the soils? And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the work I did with the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. They started work talking to farmers and saying, you know, how can you measure the pulse of your soils? It's going back to Dieter Helm's, you know, we can't be, is it better to be approximately right or precisely wrong? So we may not be able to precisely measure everything on farm, but can we get an idea of what's going on in our soils, and can we do that ourselves? So working with Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, we went onto farms, and first farm was Ian Boyd's, and actually started doing some soil tests, basic soil tests that farmers can do yourselves, like you may have heard of the slate test, or a bricks reading, just even looking how many species you have in you know, a quadrat in 10 places in a field. And by doing those simple observations, you can then amass information over time and then start to see trends. And that can help you see what's going on your farm, regardless of what the science says. So, one thing that we did do is created a free online guide that gives you information on all the different tests that came out of the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association meetings about what scientists and farmers thought were a good idea to measure in the field. I can give a plug. Yeah, quick. So we're at the table at the back where the PFLA are, and you can pick up one of these cards, and it has the website soils.sectormentor.com on the back. Or you can go on the agroecology website, they also have some articles about it. And then off the back of that, where I'm involved also, is we created an app that allows you to easily record those observations as you go. That's not free, that's £120 a year, and it keeps all the information and starts to make the graphs of how things change over time. So I do have a question for my plug. I guess my question is that you guys have all done amazing work, and you must, along the way, have done things to check, am I doing the right thing? How are things moving forward? I know some of it's visual and some of it's instinctual, but also you have to know, you know, you try things here. How do you know if it was right or wrong? There must be things because soil organic matter takes a long time to change. You know, you gave us a 4-year period. How did you know in the middle what was going on?
So when at Blaston, so you're absolutely right about collecting data, and I think that's fantastic. So, and what we did at Blaston when we were embarking on this, we base tested the whole of the farm. Now there's so much data you can collect out there, and we're learning continually about extra data we should. But we did quite a comprehensive test of our base data, and then we built in, we break the farm into thirds, and we do 3 yearly sort of rotational testing, going back to the GPS position, same spot every year, do the same tests. What we're learning as we go along is that there's variations and fluctuations in the tests. We try and be as accurate using the same sample techniques, same labs, but what we're looking for is trends. We're not looking for precise data, we're looking for trends, and that's kind of a message which we've learned, I think.
The only thing I would add is what was exciting for me after we went back into arable after 5 years of grass, and then we actually looked at the worm count. And the worm count in that then arable field was almost the same as permanent pasture, which had never been touched for like hundreds of years because it was ridge and furrow, since the Middle Ages. So that was a check that we were on the right track.
I'm going to try to make sure that we get equal sides here. So I've got a microphone over here. If your questions could be very quick and say who you are, that would be tremendous. And then you after that. Thank you.
Hi, Paul Cherry, Groundswell Agriculture. Great fun doing these 4-year herbal days. Well done. They're great things. The fun bit is growing and grazing them. How do you end that 4-year? What do you do after the 4 years? And please don't say plough.
No, absolutely not. We don't use, we definitely do not plough. We have a no plough policy at Blaston. What we actually do, this is leading on to something I was really excited, Joel, saw your slide about clover. So a lot of I'm using living mulches. So a lot of our layers are very white clover. There are a lot of white clover in them. And so what we do when we getting to the end of that grass lay, we will lightly spray it off with Roundup, but a very dilute solution of it. But we then, But this is really important that we're getting to. So we kill off the grass, we spray off the grass, but then we keep our clover, we keep our white clover. We then actually will then direct drill into that, our cereal crop, whatever it is, and at the same time we overseed more white clover. And then what we're moving to is we're then moving to the system where we're keeping this continual white clover living mulch, essentially in the bottom of our combinable crops, moving forward.
And talk about the rolling it and stressing it.
Right. Okay. So very quickly, so if we have a living mulch of white clover in the bottom of our combinable crops, that is fixing a lot of nitrogen. But to release its nitrogen, I'm oversimplifying this, so jump in if I get this wrong. But when it's fixing lots of nitrogen, but to release its nitrogen, you have to stress it. So we stress it either by rolling it, or you could spray it off with Roundup. We don't, but roll it or graze it. Once you stress it, it releases its nitrogen, and then that nitrogen is then readily available for your cereal crop, which we're putting in. So in our case, spring barley. And actually we do it. So we pull back our spring barley nitrogen applications by about 50 kgs because it's got that readily available N there in the soil for it. Now, we're still in our infancy on this, and actually we are teaching ourselves as we go along on this. But we've hopefully just managed to get Centre for Ecology and Hydrology signed up to give us some funding and not do it properly, but give us more help with it. But in coming back to your question, do not plough, in my advice. Sorry, just someone else wanted to add.
Well, just another approach to something we've done this year. The new farm we took on, there was some 2-year-old ryegrass clover lays that we wanted to get rid of because we just find they're not very good for holding up the cattle long term. So we terminated that just with the cattle. It was the last field in our winter rotation, and we just didn't put a back fence on it, so they kept going back over it. We've terminated that. We've got the rolling impacts. They've eaten it all off. We've got plenty of soil contact potentially, and then what we've done is we've just broadcast on some fast-growing annuals to come in this year, but also with some deep-rooting grasses and herbs in there as well that will follow those on. So although that's not strictly an arable crop to follow, it's going to be a high-production crop that'll add organic matter, but you could do something similar with that, plant straight into it.
Okay, thank you. There's one just here who yes.
Kim, you mentioned David Attenborough. Do you not think it's would it work if we commissioned him to do a Blue Planet type film? Would it have the same effect on as it has on plastics for soils? I mean, Elaine Ingham and people like that. Years ago at Soil Association, I saw some wonderful slides of work that she's done. There's a really interesting story, and I think the public are now sufficiently interested. The BBC have just done a programme the last few days on Radio 4 about human, the human biome and the macro biotics that are going on in the human gut. I think the time is right, and please could we try and persuade him to using all the people in the room with their soils. It would make a wonderful story.
Well, funny you should mention that. I think you don't commission David Attenborough. He decides what he'd like to do. But one extremely good thing is he doesn't like vegetables and he loves meat. So I might use that as an angle to get to him. But you're right, it takes someone of that stature and that seriousness to reach deep into the mass psyche. And if we could get him, that would be astonishing. But it's where he's choosing to go with what's left. So, yeah, thank you. Any more questions? Just at the back here.
Hi, Mike Deptford. What do you do with your digestate? You spread it on the land?
So
it's pretty farming.
to me about aggregate?
Well, you've got
Yes.
a lady in front of you, so there's built some waste from that, it has to be used somewhere, presumably.
Absolutely. No, we apply it to agricultural land. We take in about 20 lorry loads of domestic organic waste a day, and we provide power to about 5,000 homes for each plant, and we spread the digestate on about 2,000 acres per plant.
Sorry, you put that on the crop itself or on bare land?
Well, we're obviously restricted at the time of year where we can do it, so it would tend to be on a growing crop.
Thanks.
Right, a question here, but also Patrick's using his prerogative again for a question. In fact, sorry, yes.
Charity Gardner from East Sussex. It's wonderful to see alternative husbandry coming back again. This is what we were doing in the 1960s. And also for the first time I see that Andre Voisin, 1959, being quoted. Great. Question about soils. I know Patrick is aware of this, and we've also heard at the ORFC Elaine Ingham talking about it. The Shume, and they have a sample farm in Wiltshire, and they are planting the same plant year after year, saving the seed on the same bit of soil, and the yields go up.
Wow.
Why? They've got 15,000 women doing it in Zambia, and we've just started a pilot project in Malawi.
I can answer this one. It is because plants are an expression of their environment. Their genes get turned on and get activated based on cues and triggers that come in from the environment. And when, therefore, they grow in that season, they turn on all the right genes that they needed to thrive in that environment. And then they pass those through in a more upregulated, more active state into the seed. And then that seed gets planted the next year. It's already got the right genes mobilized and active to be better performing in that environment. And seed saving is very, very important, and we absolutely should be doing it. We also know that if a plant is challenged by a pathogen during that growing year, plants have an immune system. It can turn on its immune system to fight that pathogen. That is immunity that can also be passed to the seed, and we know that the next generation has an inbuilt immunity because of the parent that was exposed to that pathogen. But it is only passed on to one generation. It doesn't carry on, but we know that it's certainly possible that the progeny will have resistance because its parent turned on that gene. And it is an example of why we absolutely should be saving more and more of our seeds, because of those seeds will be expressing the right genes for your soil type, for your microbial communities, and getting better and better year after year.
And does immunity go through the mycorrhizal system as well, or is that just a signal that the pathogen is around?
Plants can also transfer immune signals through mycorrhizal fungi, yes. There was a very famous study done on tomatoes. They grew them in little air bubbles, so they weren't sharing airspace, in an enclosed vessel, but they were growing in the same soil, sharing root space. One of the tomatoes was challenged with blight, and the other tomato, its immune system was turned on. 6 defense genes were activated in that other tomato. The tomatoes do release stress volatiles into the air. It couldn't have been that because they were growing in this little bubble. We know that the tomato sent that stress signal down through the mycorrhizal fungi. It transported it to the other tomato. 6 defense genes were mobilized in that tomato. So also through soil.
Patrick.
I want to raise the G word, glyphosate. Joel mentioned it briefly. I have heard about some research conducted in the University of Missouri by Professor Bob Kremer, which suggests that glyphosate has a negative impact on the soil biome. I wondered whether you knew about that, because obviously it's a critical issue for Roundup use in the UK, which a lot of farmers are using because of the wet climate and the tendency for you can't use min-till methods to suppress weeds as effectively as, for instance, you could in Australia.
Okay, of course, I know this is a super hot and tricky issue. It's all about trade-offs. Of course, we have to make those decisions. The honest answer, Patrick, is that I could present to you evidence that shows that glyphosate is absolutely damaging on soil biota. It absolutely affects mycorrhizal fungi. Yes, earthworms. Yes, that evidence is there. I could also present you with evidence that shows it doesn't affect these things, that it can have very minimal or negligible effect on certain aspects of soil life. There is both of those evidences out there. I could also show some evidence that shows that the plough is very bad for fungi, the plough is very bad for soil biota, but also that the plough can also be used in a way that can also support soil life if that negative damage is offset and rebalanced by putting carbon, putting feed back into the soil. So I can present arguments on both sides, evidence, and argue both sides of that debate. And what I was trying to obviously highlight in my talk, and it overlaps with Paul, your question as well, sure, we can lock into that debate about which is the best or right or wrong way to do that, and sure, that's a discussion to have, or is it more important to focus on the fact that let's get more arable growers introducing a 4-year rotational lay? Is that a more important conversation to be happening? Sure, then there's a debate on the termination of that at the end. But is that more important, or is just getting more carbon into soils more important? And that's the question that we have to have. I like to. We have this idea that fence sitters are weak, they're a cop-out, they can't make an opinion. I consider myself a fence sitter, and I love being a fence sitter, and I think it's a harder position to take. Because then I can cop it from both sides. When I bag glyphosate, people hate me. When I bag the plough, people hate me as well. And in a way, that's a difficult position, and I think it is that nuance between these extremes, between these left and rights, that is an important space to occupy. It's that qualitative nature of how and why we do things. So for me, I don't like to fixate on that. I think there's a much more bigger, important conversation that we should be having. There is benefits to not disturbing the soil, absolutely. Unfortunately, yeah, glyphosate is maybe a tool that's part of that, but there are hopefully other tools. There's a lot of work being done looking at essential oils, having both fungicidal, insecticidal, and herbicidal properties. There is some alternatives, hopefully, that can come out of that. But the drive and the impulse around no-till, and the fact that no-till farmers are caring about soil health, that's an important energy that we shouldn't squash. We have to foster and facilitate that energy and then steer it in the right direction. That's my view.
Yeah, fantastically brave and subtle answer, and actually... but keeping that subtlety in it is key to keeping the science sophisticated, and keeping that sophistication and nuanced subtlety and getting a clear message across is really tricky. But I think if the message is too blunt, it misses all of those points. And you're telling me now Any more questions? There's one at the back over there. Okay, all right.
I may have a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Last year I had a bit of disaster. I grew a cover crop of black oaks. It didn't come. A lot of lay species came. A variety of species amongst that. Some I thought it was going to be disaster, but I multi-roller crimped this device. I've developed, Ted Connect of Auburn University developed a machine I built where it rolls the cover crop down 3 times. I was thinking it wasn't going to work. I rolled it down, it suppressed the weeds or the cover crop so much I was able to grow a crop of beans, it looked tremendous. Even my conventional neighbours were saying how well it looked. I was surprised, but unfortunately I chose the wrong year where the bees weren't flying. It's a bit like Iceland and the ash volcano. I had the wrong flying conditions for the bees, so pollination didn't occur. But I'm not giving up. I'm doing aerial wind pollinated crops forthcoming, perhaps go down the bean route or the bee pollinated a bit later on once I've established this. But there are ways of actually, without ploughing, without using glyphosate, that can go forward. And I'm just watch your space, please.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, the roller crimper is obviously a really hot issue. It's, in North America, it's being far more adopted than here. We have the challenges of the moist climate and the slugs, and I understand that. And however, that does provide an example of how the right innovative thinking can lead to new practices, new ways to do this without that. Sure, we need to refine it and tweak it under these climatic conditions, but the principle of what it's trying to do is valuable, is something we need to definitely look into and foster. Yeah.
I can see stomachs beginning to rumble, so can we have 3 rapid questions? Certainly a couple over here, and there's another one, a microphone somewhere here. 3 rapid questions, and then we can escape for lunch. But in rapid succession as well. Okay.
I'll be quick. Jo Philpott from Cornwall. Just on the issue of social media, I'd just like to urge all farmers, all livestock farmers who use herbal lays, just to shamelessly cast photos on the web, because at the moment George Monbiot and the vegans have taken the environmental higher, whatever the word is, and the biodiversity and pollinators and all that kind of stuff, that the carbon sequestration isn't coming out clearly on the nets. And so yes, some beautiful photos when they're all in flower in May, I think would be quite powerful.
Fantastic. Next. Has someone got, yes, great.
Yeah, hi, James Allen, Heritage Graziers. We do conservation grazing in the local Cotswold area here. So, Tom, you said, interesting that the grazier brings fencing, does the movements, and obviously there's a fair amount of commitment there from the grazier. And then, Rob, you talked about trying to get long-term commitments to give that support, give that comfort for the grazier that he has a business going forward. How do we get large landowners or estate managers to support them to be able to give long-term commitments for grazing agreements for graziers to come do what they want and have a business going forward?
And then we'll have the third question, and then is the third question there? No? Okay, then just answer that.
I think one of the issues on that is that, dare I say, that the landowner who isn't really the farmer is giving short-term contracts so that they can get their hands on the subsidy, which is supposed to be for the farmer. And that's it. Agents are very good at finding all sorts of legal vehicles to allow that to happen. I think it's again, we heard yesterday how all the tax incentives and all the subsidies have impacted land values, and therefore return on capital is the same with rental agreements. And I think that's something that needs to change. If the subsidies weren't there, rents would be lower, and it would be a lot easier to come up with more innovative, longer term solutions. I do think that there's, like everything, it's not just business solves things, as Joel was saying. There's a moral imperative that if you're expecting someone to spend all their time and you know, if you want them to have a sustainable long-term business to support their family, that we've all got to try and provide that intergenerational stability as well in all that we do.
Thank you. Okay, just one last question, and then I'll ask you all to...
It's related to the last question. I'm actually a land agent. I think there's been a promotion within our profession of short-term agreements, 2-year farm business tenancies, which have been disastrous on the soil, actually with high rents, tenders, etc., etc. And dare I say it, maize contracts of £500 an acre put into biogas plants, which is awful. I have been working with some more share farming agreements recently, whereby the landowner and the occupier are together in the whole system and moving forwards. And I think that might be a way that we could resolve this in partnership and community along those lines.
Fantastic question.
Just quickly, I totally and absolutely endorse that, and actually that's a really great way.
So segregated into arable and livestock, that kind of cooperation and lateral thinking, I think, is the way forward. We have transitioned into something much more mended. So we are going to have lunch now, but I'd like each of the members to make a final point if you'd like to, or if you're very hungry, don't. Joel.
I guess I'll just perhaps, I think the issue of pesticides, chemicals, glyphosate, I mean, that's obviously something that's really struck a chord there. Let me just restate my position that my brand of education, my interests, my passion, you'll never find me endorsing the use of these. I'm being a practical realist, acknowledging that they are part of the system at the moment, and rather than block that, we have to understand how to work with conventional farmers to help this transition. So all I'm saying is that I think we need to start from a point that agrees that we need to transition away from chemicals. That is my position, and in that transition away, that does maybe not mean no chemicals, it may mean a transition away from them, minimizing them down more and more through that transition. That is my position on that. I'm not necessarily endorsing them by any means, but I just want us not only to get onto the same page, but then also to be moving in the same direction. And that's why I think we have to come and meet in the middle there. And I know it's a tricky, sticky compromise, but it's something that has to be done, I think.
Hylton.
Well, I think I'd like to leave you with the imperative of climate change. And we're all stakeholders in the future, but perhaps the biggest stakeholders of all are the biggest landowners. We've got more to lose if we go off the edge of the cliff than others. And I think we have to persuade them to move away from this short-termism and think of the longer term, not just of their own inheritances, but their own contribution to society. And I do think we have a historic moment of opportunity to actually reward those people for pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back in the soil where it's going to be so good for all of us.
My point would be on, we've heard a lot about herbal lays today. I see a lot of those filled with grasses that are non-fertile hybrids, the big push on fesculoliums and things like that at the moment. Our native pastures, our native species, they're what help our native wildlife the most. They've been, you know, the perfection of creation that we've been given as a model, we haven't managed to beat yet. So let's use that. And I use the quote that one of the farmers in our Blaston farmer group came up with, that there's a place for a wildflower meadow on every farm.
I think my closing comments would be that we're at a massive point of change in agriculture at the moment. And we as people working within it can influence and can make this change happen. But in order to do that, we have to have one voice, and we have to all work together. And frankly, we have to put aside our pride and accept that we're going to have to step out of our comfort zones and things that we've done for the last 20, 30 generational years and embrace the change that we've got. Because if we don't, we're going to get this horribly wrong for the next generation.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Joel, for sitting on an intelligent fence. Thank you, Hylton, for coming back from the rainforest with such inspiration and funds. And thank Rob and Tom for really showing that it can be done in the most straightforward and natural ways, and for the energy and passion with which you do it. I mean, I come away from this a lot more optimistic. It does work, and it can be profitable. And my final thought is, we are on this edge. There is a way forward. We've just got to get that message out, and we've got to capture the idea amongst the urban population that health, beauty, and practical farming are the way forward. Thank you very much.